So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second in our new policy webinar series, Rhetoric to Reality, where we are trying to avoid the word policy, actually, but that will obviously come up at various points. I'm really trying to make this series a thought-provoking series as well, trying to get beyond the usual policy debates and also really crucially hearing from the people here, and not just our speakers who are going to put some hopefully new ideas in people's heads, but also from our attendees as well, from our social entrepreneurs in particular, just to really hear your views on this topic and hear how we might empower you as social entrepreneurs as well as your service users. So we will get straight to our first speaker, who is Elizabeth Docherty from the Scottish Community Alliance.
Thanks, Duncan. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Got a few slides to get started, so hopefully you can see that. So as Duncan said, I am Elizabeth Docherty, Director at Scottish Community Alliance. We are a coalition of 29 national networks and intermediaries across Scotland, representing a different aspect of Scotland's community sector. We've been around for about 14 years, and our main aims are really about working with our members and stakeholders across Scotland, really to establish that deeper collaboration, connectivity, and contribution that they can maximise together, raising the profile of the community sector as a whole with a range of stakeholders, and really to support and influence national and local policy. I've been in post about a year now, and during that time, we've also established 3 priority policy areas that we want to focus on that we believe really harnesses all of our members and the community sector. So that is a community wealth building, local democracy, and the wellbeing economy. And the local democracy work that's been happening is what I'm going to focus on in terms of this session today. So I don't know if many of you know of this work, but it's been going on for quite a while, as you can see from this time frame. In 2017, Scottish Government and COSLA launched a local governance review to look at communities having greater control and influence over the decisions that matter to them most. And over the course of the number of years, there's been a couple of consultations. So the first one was in May 2018. That was the first phase of Democracy Matters, 4,000 people, hundreds of events across Scotland, really looking at the future of community decision making and the benefits that that might bring. Overwhelmingly, that consultation really said that communities would flourish if they had more control and influence over the decisions that matter to them most. Work then carried on, and in August 23, Democracy Matters 2 was launched, and that really again brought communities from across Scotland together to really look at how community decision and local decision making would work in their own community. That report was launched in September 24 and really started to look at the ideas of taking it from idea into implementation and the challenges that would surround that. As a result of that, a steering group was set up from a range of stakeholders across Scotland and different aspects of our kind of citizens and communities to meet every 6 weeks to really debate and discuss what local decision-making models look like. I've put a link there just to take you to more of those papers where you can have a bit of a deeper dive into it. We're part of that steering group, so I wanted to talk a bit about what we're mindful of when we're having these discussions so far. So the discussions have been based on the engagement process findings that I've just highlighted, and we're really there to enable that conversation to happen. You can see some of the things on the slide that have been on the table. What I would say is that everything's been on the table and nothing's been off it. And it's really still under development. No decisions have been taken so far, and the views here are not of anyone in particular in terms of ministers, COSLA, ourselves, steering group. It was really just an all-encompassing conversation about what is available to us and what could that look like. But I really wanted to focus on the things that we're really mindful of when we're having these discussions. And I suppose the first one is probably a real given. Any decisions we take about creating a community or local decision-making model has to really provide communities with greater and more meaningful influence and control over the decisions that are happening in their communities. What's coming out really strongly when we're having conversations is community action plans. So that plan that really involves communities in deciding what matters most to them and helps shape what needs to be done. Really bringing that goal setting, collaboration and engagement within communities. But we are really mindful that there's a lot of plans in communities. There's a lot of clutter, and with that comes confusion. So for us, we're really mindful of how does this work in Democracy Matters, rationalise those plans and simplify it for a more long-lasting change. Any new model that is created must come with some resourcing, the appropriate resourcing to support and make it sustainable. And when we talk about resourcing, we're not just talking about the financial element, but also looking at the capacity building that might be needed in our communities to look at local decision making. We're mindful that we have to ensure that all groups are able to participate in community decision making and their rights are not infringed as part of anything that we create. And look at how we engage people that might not necessarily be already part of or participating in community decision making or have strong links to the community, and how we do engage those people. And for us, one of the key important fundamentals is really that the model should be an independent body that is enabled and interact with the existing structures that are around and not duplicate structures or organisations that are currently working within our communities today. So where are we now? The steering group are breaking down into policy circles. This is where we're now getting a deeper dive into the policy development around what that decision-making model and process looks like. So we will be looking at structure. So what does that vehicle look like when we are talking about local decision-making? How is that accountable and how is it regulated? What capacity building are we actually talking about when we're looking at local decision-making within communities? And real scrutiny around the finance and the realistic finances that need to be available for this to work effectively. Where we're heading to is that in the recent programme for government, it's been committed to that there will be a blueprint for a democratic decision-making models with tests before the end of the parliamentary term. So that's next year. So that's a time frame that we're working to with this work at this stage. Our own plans. So as I said, local democracy is a real policy priority for us. So we're putting a lot of energy into this along with our members. So our 25-26 manifesto is all about local democracy. We're calling for a modern democratic structure that's fit for today's needs. We're asking for it to be in legislation. We're wanting it to be involved and acknowledge the expertise and experience within our communities. And we're looking for it to be properly resourced along with our communities and our intermediaries who are enabling and supporting that environment. The other couple of things that we're focusing on is a local democracy campaign. So again, we're looking here to just raise the profile on why and how new democratic structures would empower communities and that it would drive meaningful and sustainable change. So that will be coming out in the next couple of months. And next year, we're holding a communities conference that will bring the community sector together with partners to focus on local democracy, as well as community wealth building and community empowerment, and how those policies are enabling just now and what changes may need to be effected in the future. So there's a lot of exciting things happening for us. That is a real whistle-stop tour over the Democracy Matters agenda. It's a very complex area. There's lots of detail within here, so I appreciate if anybody wants to pick this up with me later, I'd be more than happy to, but thanks very much for your time, and I'll stop sharing just now.
That's great. Thanks, Elizabeth. I think it's a really good roundup of the initiative. Something we're involved with as well, actually. Something that's quite a lot of potentially. So we'll move on to our next speaker just now, who is Oliver Escobar from University of Edinburgh.
Yep. Hi, everybody. I don't have slides, so I'll just try to run through a few points I would like to make. And thanks for organizing and for the invitation. So I'm a professor of public policy and democratic innovation at the University of Edinburgh. And I follow with great interest the social economy and the social enterprise world, although my research is more about democratic innovations, so new institutions and new forms of governance, which I think is highly relevant to the world of the social economy. So I'll make that connection as I go. But taking the theme of today's webinar, to make sure that power to the people is more than rhetoric, we do need to democratize existing institutions as well as create new ones. That is the premise of a lot of the work that we do. And that means not just existing institutions in political life, which need change, reform, and innovation, but also the institutions of the economy, which to me, the social enterprise movement is at its best a movement that works towards a more democratic economy. But to reach its full potential, it needs policy processes that take the social economy seriously. And that means a more ambitious community empowerment agenda, which in Scotland is unfinished business. There was a lot of momentum around 10 years ago, a bit before that, but things have stalled. Of course, the pandemic had some influence on this, but there are other forces at play in trying to take the community empowerment agenda to what it should be. So this is where my field, the field of democratic innovation, tries to focus on how to rewire our governance systems across society, the economy, the state, and so that we can govern ourselves better, so that we can distribute power more evenly, so that we can mobilize the collective intelligence of our communities. When I talk about new institutions, what I have in mind, I mean, there are lots of varieties and examples all over the world, and Scotland has experimented quite a bit with this as well. But it's things like participatory budgets, citizens' assemblies, new forms of digital crowdsourcing. In Scotland, the role of community anchor organisations has been really important in democratic innovation. Other forms of collaborative governance, which are based on principles of the commons or community empowerment, and trying to get beyond that binary of public versus private. And some people are critical of these innovations, and they have good reasons. Their work depends on how they are developed and the extent to which they are empowered. And we have examples in Scotland where things, take for example Scotland's Climate Assembly, which put forward a fairly ambitious agenda, which touched on questions of the social economy, a well-being economy, an economy that works for people and planet, with very specific measures that then the Scottish government has largely ignored. So Scotland has made some progress on democratic innovation, but this has possibly reached the glass ceiling of our current institutional arrangements. And without broader reform, local governance reform, financial reform, economic policy reform, democratic innovations will remain limited in their capacity to redistribute power. And this includes current policy agendas on community wealth building, the well-being economy, and the democracy matters policy agenda. Now, I just want to make the point that social entrepreneurs and democratic innovators have a lot of things in common. They are trying to change complex systems and relationships. And some social entrepreneurs are democratic innovators who have built organizations through participatory practices. So there's a lot of cross fertilization there. But then social enterprise and social economy has a fundamental role in democratic innovation in at least two ways. Some of the role has to do with advocacy. Many people in the social enterprise community have advocated for democratic innovations and supported them. I think partly because democratic innovations offer spaces that might be more constructive and positive for the social economy vision. And then a second key role is the contribution that social entrepreneurs have made to democratic innovations. I mean, in many places, participatory budgeting has had social enterprises at its heart. Citizens' panels in the Scottish Parliament have a lot of potential now to open more space for the social economy. The Scottish Climate Assembly, for example, heard from cooperatives and other forms of economic organization in the social economy. So there's a lot of connection there. But why should social enterprise care about democratic innovation? I'll give you 3 reasons, and then we can discuss them later. One is because we need to open up the black boxes of decision making so that the social economy gets a fairer chance to develop in Scotland, at least to its full potential. The second is that participating in policy and decision-making spaces that have the potential to overcome capture by powerful interests is more likely if it's done through democratic innovations rather than traditional institutions. And third, because, and this is a point I make not just to social entrepreneurs, but to all kinds of activists, that you have nothing to fear from democratic innovations if you have the strength of conviction in your argument and the evidence and the cause that you're supporting. Because democratic innovations, guess where the resources go when you give the power to the people to decide where they should go? They tend to go to the things that we all care: health and good transport and good education. And so democratic innovations are spaces where we eliminate the noise of powerful interest interference, and that gives a better shot to social enterprise, I would argue. But to conclude, we must be clear-sighted. Despite some state support for a social economy in Scotland, this really pales in comparison to the subsidies that go to large interests in the private sector. Look at the UK. I mean, the corporate welfare bill is striking. We're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds that are being funneled from the public purse towards the corporate sector. So even if a small fraction of that went into the social economy, we will really have the potential for change at a very substantial level. So to conclude, just this very short provocation, I think there will be more or less agreement in this session that we do face a number of crises, and they are going to demand a lot from us over the next 10, 20 years. A lot is at stake. And I do think social enterprise and the social enterprise community, broadly understood, is going to have to play a key role in helping us to transform our current systems. And I think that that's where the connection to democratic innovation needs to be strengthened. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Oliver. And I think it's really important to obviously place democratic innovation within that social enterprise context as well. So that's really, really useful, I think. So we'll move on to our third speaker now, who is Craig Dalzell from Common Weal.
Hi, folks. Duncan didn't tell me I wasn't allowed to use the P word in this speech. I don't have time to rewrite it, so
it's okay.
2 years ago, I was asked if I could pass one policy. What would it be? And I chose housing regulations. I thought energy efficiency in housing should meet passive house standards, and we got that. That's now coming to Scotland. This year, I've been mostly shouting about universal basic income. Haven't won that yet, but it's technically currently a majority in Parliament for that. Oh, am I not coming through? Okay, I'll try and speak a bit louder. Sorry. Okay, I hope that's better. Next year, given the elections are coming, how about I ask for democracy to be fixed? When we're talking about local democracy in Scotland in particular, we need to understand the scale of the problem and what should be the minimum scale of the ambition. Scotland is the least locally democratic country in Europe. Now, this isn't a speech about Scottish independence, but if independence happened today and the Scotland Act was repealed and all of the reserve powers at the UK level were moved to Scotland, then they would all flow into Holyrood. If that happened and nothing else, around 85% of all public money spent in Scotland would be controlled by the Scottish Government. In practice, that number's higher because Holyrood also controls local authority block grants. It applies funding mandates to ring-fence local government spending, and it's been quite happy to bribe and outright bully local government when it wants to do things like freeze council tax. Let's be clear. If in some countries in Europe, if a minister interfered with local government tax powers like council tax like that, they'd be hauled in front of the Constitutional Court. But that's not the fix I want. What I want is what every normal democracy in Europe has and Scotland doesn't have, which is an actually local government. We entirely lack a normal democratic system of municipal government in Scotland. Some of our communities have community councils, mine doesn't. Some of those community councils aren't ossified or completely dysfunctional. Some of them actually are doing good work, but none of them are powerful enough. Not like a true municipal council. My German father-in-law, his municipal council controls proportionally almost as much public spending per capita as my local authority does. He would call my local authority his regional government. So that's my first ask. The kind of local democracy that the rest of Europe calls normal. My second is on the other side of the power to the people coin. Holyrood doesn't have an upper chamber like a lot of government bodies do. The committees in Holyrood that scrutinise legislation do a lot of good work, but they're too small. There aren't enough MSPs to fill them, and they're too prone to being packed by party interests as well. We don't need a House of Scottish Lords, though. The Lords down south do their job best when they're also not beholden to party or government interests, but it's also prone to being packed against that. And anyway, giving people a lifetime appointment to a legislative body and making them legally your better is not democracy. It's a complete anathema to democracy. So I want to see a House of Citizens. Like Oliver said, I want to see citizens' assemblies embedded into our democracy. For those who are not familiar, Oliver's obviously the expert in the room here, but very briefly, these would be drawn randomly, a bit like jury duty, balanced against the demography of Scotland. Members would be paid and would serve a limited time, maybe 1 or 2 years, with the portions of the assembly rotating out every 6 or 12 months. We can debate how much power we would want to give this House of Citizens to initiate legislation, but they should be able to scrutinise legislation and to oversee our elected politicians in the lower house, as well as unelected folk like commissioners or civil servants and the like. If we trust juries to decide if someone has transgressed our laws, then we can trust us to decide if the law itself is fit for purpose. So that's my hope. Power to communities at a local level, governing themselves, and power to citizens, power to people at the very top, overseeing those we vote to represent us. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Craig. And I think it's really important, I think, to mention, especially in this context, local government. I think that's the fact we don't really have local government in this country yet, and I think a lot of our members, I think, would certainly relate to that point. And just moving into our fourth and final speaker now, who is Mia Lalanne from Scottish Rural Action.
Hello, everyone. These are really tough acts to follow. What I will be saying will not sound half as clever or as visionary as what we've just heard from Elizabeth and Oliver and Craig, but I'll jump straight into it, and hopefully some of you might find some of the things that we're doing here at SRA helpful as you're trying to bring participatory processes to the ground, to yourselves as social entrepreneurs or service users or anyone else operating within that space. So we'll be talking for a little bit about effective co-design and co-delivery of participatory platforms. So just by way of introduction, I'm a project coordinator with Scottish Rural Action. Our main area of work is to build those platforms that are required for powerful rural and island movements that's led grassroots by all the sectors, all working together. So in the last few months, really, we've done some absolutely amazing events, what we'd call platforms. So one of them was about young people coming together from across rural and island. That happened in Inverness. We also had the Islands Economy Showcase at the Scottish Parliament, which we hosted alongside the cross-party group on islands. And that brought together well over 100 island-based businesses, stakeholders in front of MSPs right in the centre of Edinburgh. We also had more recently the Communities Showcase tent at the Royal Highland Show, which was essentially a takeover of the Scottish Government marquee. And what we really wanted to do was put communities and rural communities at the heart of, you know, the space that's very much focused on big businesses and a lot of other interests. And we felt communities belonged right in the center of it, and Scottish Government agreed, which was brilliant. But what I want to say about all the above is that they were all co-organized with many, many others. Because at SRA, we're trying to really push forward participatory approaches. We think there are so many pros and cons, which I'll get into it. But yeah, I just want to share kind of how we're doing this, what we've learned from this, and hopefully when we get to the questions and answers part of this session, yeah, I can hear from you guys if there's anything else that I've missed or glossed over that might be helpful for you. So quick note about participatory. I think in event design, event planning, that's quite widely used. It's a popular concept. You know, it's about the event participants being able to engage, being able to contribute to the program, which we all find creates a sense of shared ownership, satisfaction, all those great things over the actual event. What SRA and I'm sure many others are trying to do is really push for participants to be involved across the entire process, especially before and deciding what this event is going to be, who's going to be involved, and so on. Of course, during and also post in terms of reporting, distribution, all of those things. And it is more complex in participatory events. I think, you know, the goal will be to create that sense of shared ownership and so on. When someone is when we're opening up the process to many others, there's a lot more work to be done by kind of the host organization, or what we call the secretariat, to kind of really understand what the co-organizers are trying to get out of this, and what's realistic, and how can that host organization kind of fill in those gaps and contribute capacity at the same time. But at the end, we are focusing on creating an inclusive platform where all the other co-organizers are taking the lead. So there are definitely challenges to this approach, and there are also some absolutely amazing benefits that make it all worth it. So I will kind of read through this. Hopefully everyone can see it. And I've shared the slides as well with Andy and Duncan, so I'm happy for those to also be circulated later, as I know it's a bit wordy. Kind of the key challenge is that funders might not be familiar with the concept. And so when we say, right, we want all of those other people to come with us to this meeting, they might assume it's a steering group. And sometimes we let that fly, and sometimes we kind of put our foot down and say, no, actually, they are the co-curators, they are the co-organizers, we are working with them, not just for them. And then, of course, there's a note about capacity. So co-organizers, you know, there might be, if you're planning something over a couple of months or even a year, some co-organizers might need to duck in and duck out for various reasons. They might also not be able to work at the same pace or at the same speed if they have to check through multiple levels. So there's a little bit of sensitivity, a little bit of creativity, and honestly, it all comes down to this being a trust-based exercise. This is a collaborative thing. So usually it's up to the host organization to take on that extra effort to keeping the channels of communication open and respectful. And empathy is always a good idea as well. But some of the key benefits is that we have found that this actually truly harnesses the diversity and the nuances and the complexity of lived experience and priorities, especially as Scottish Rural Action. We're trying to uplift underrepresented areas, usually in rural and island places. So all of this talk, especially from the funders side of grassroots, community-led, we can actually demonstrate that we are making this work. And I've put in bold peer support and knowledge sharing. What people draw from the entire experience, not just the event itself, not just participating in the event, but participating across the entire process, pre, during, and post the event. We've had feedback that this is really valuable. It builds a network. It opens up doors for peer-to-peer support, peer-to-peer knowledge sharing. And many of them actually feel empowered and upskilled to then go forward solo, which is absolutely amazing. This picture is from a young person who actually attended one of those events earlier this year that I mentioned in Inverness. And apparently the day after that event, she was like, oh, we can do this ourselves. And she basically came together with some of her colleagues and just put together an event with decision makers, local authorities, just made it work, made it happen. And that is exactly what we're seeing in quite a few different directions, just from people having had the experience, having had the invitation of being part of this wider process. Really quickly about a case study. So those are just very, very broad points. So Scottish Rural Island, Scottish Rural Action, our flagship project is the Scottish Rural and Islands Parliament series. So we call ourselves our co-secretariat for that. And so a little bit about the process is that we sent out a call for co-curators through our membership, through existing partners, many of them, such as the Scottish Communities Alliance, our member-led networks themselves. So the call went very widely. And then we had 5 months to basically do those planning meetings. Over 60 co-curators signed up. So we're all bashing together different elements of the Scottish Rural and Islands Parliament all together. 20 of them were specifically for the youth day, youth element itself, or the youth parliament itself. And then along the way, what we wanted to focus on was clear recognition and celebration of the co-curators' role. So really making sure everyone knew that they had taken the lead on this. And so some of the results have been absolutely amazing. And for me, the best part is the momentum is continuing, because people didn't just show up, get an event delivered to them, and then leave again. They felt ownership, and they are invested as much as we are in what comes next, and when are we doing this again, and what are all the offshoots and all of the other ways that we can keep that momentum going. So last few slides, what we've learned and we want to share today is engagement fatigue. Don't let that be an excuse, whether it's for consultations, whether it's for attending events, all of that, it is not a thing. Being hard to reach is also not a valid excuse. We have found that, and we want to really encourage everyone to think that if the platform is meaningful, if it will contribute something to your service users, to your volunteers, to your members, they will show up. So one very quick example is this Islands Economy Showcase that we did back in Scottish Parliament. We invited 30 small business owners to basically, or possibly the busiest people ever. And we said, do you want to be a part of this? And every single person except one said yes. So yeah, these are our main takeaways, essentially, that we would strongly encourage people to keep in the back of their minds. Thank you. And any questions, this is my email.
Brilliant, thanks, Mia. I say this all the time, but I think there's so much we can learn from our rural and island areas, to be honest, in terms of not just democratic innovation and getting people's voices heard, but also social enterprise in general. So there's a lot of good stuff happening there. So I think a lot of urban areas can learn from our rural areas. So that's all 4 speakers. Now I've got opportunity to hear from you as an attendee. I posted some questions in the chat, which you may or may not want to think about. Just really thinking about your own local perspective of getting your voices heard or not getting your voices heard, as the case may be. And just really thinking about what our speakers have said in terms of what most interests you. So as I said before, you can just put your hand up and unmute to ask a question, which would be ideal, but also you can post questions in the chat at any time. So we do have some questions in the chat at the moment. I could just start there. So a question from David. How does the governance system itself get changed? At the moment, we have no choice of election candidates or the qualifications. Once elected, they decide what we think. They give no check back before decisions are being made. Are citizens' assemblies or the Rural and Islands Parliament methods the solutions? This is quite a lot to unpack there, I guess, but I don't know if any of our speakers want to come in on that. I suppose it's how do we get governance changed? And what are the best mechanisms? Are they citizens' assemblies or something else? To any of our speakers, feel free.
I'm happy to have
go
the
for it,
first go. I mean, David usually puts forward these very key questions, right? This is the heart of it. And I don't think it's about any single mechanism. I think what you're asking is how do we get from where we are to something that looks like a more democratic form of governance, a more democratic economy, a more democratic form of organizing our communities. And I mean, obviously there's no easy fix, and what we need is almost like at least my approach, my theory of change It's something that some people call social acupuncture, when you have multiple interventions at multiple levels simultaneously. But for example, I think there are at least 3 levels that are important. One is the cultural level. Out there in the media, in public conversations every day, we see how popular and prominent are some of these narratives around populism and the advances of the far right and the type of alternatives they're putting forward. I mean, look at what's happening in Spain just now, which is where I find myself just now. I don't know if it got through the news in the UK, but essentially there are extreme fascist groups literally chasing immigrants and threatening violence. In the public discourse, there's a lot of narrative that puts forward an explanation of the crisis we're facing, how people are reacting by buying into authoritarian proposals, etc. What we need is the counter narrative, and the counter narrative is one that says that citizens and communities are the answer, and distributing power is the answer, and is the counter narrative to those minority extreme far right movements. But if you look at it in media narratives, you will hear very few stories about the many things that communities are doing. Taking Scotland, I mean, Scotland has a really vibrant community sector. The Scottish Community Alliance has documented a lot of that, but there's the development trusts movement, etc. How often do you see in the mainstream media narratives that talk about what communities are doing, how they are self-organizing, how new social enterprises are emerging to meet need and aspiration? Very little. So our public imagination is very constrained. We're not telling the stories of that alternative way of organizing ourselves, our society, our politics. So part of the theory of change, first step, culture, on the cultural level. We need to popularize these ideas, and we haven't been really good at this. In academia, we have focused too much on perhaps on the evidence and the empirics and not enough on the storytelling. So that's part of it, expanding our collective imagination so that people know there are other alternatives and they are happening as we speak. Then at the second level, there's a material level. We need those reforms that Elizabeth and Craig were talking about, and those practices that Mia was noting. In Scotland, institutional reform is long due. Politicians don't want to spend the political capital. We need to press them on so that they go in that direction. We get a proper system of local governance. We get a reform of community councils. We get community planning partnerships either reformulated or substituted or changed meaningfully. And we know how to do that because we've been for 15 years sharing evidence on how to do that. So that is important, rewiring governance systems. And then at the policy level, there are multiple interventions. I mean, Craig is here, and Common Weal has been prolific in putting forward challenging and provocative ideas. But in the end, there are all these different levels of intervention. It does come down to having political representatives who understand the moment we are living in. And to me, with exceptions, and there are exceptions, there are some politicians that get it, but they are a minority. The majority are the equivalent of the political Titanic. They see the iceberg coming and they're not changing course. We need to keep helping them to change course. They know they need help, and they're desperately seeking for help, but they cannot admit it because they need to pretend that they have the answers. They don't. The answer is in citizens and communities and the processes that are going to mobilize citizens and communities to get things done. So where we are, just a final sentence, is what I call a critical mess. There are change makers within institutions, sometimes a minority, sometimes a few more. There are change makers in communities, in community organizations, in the community sector, in the third sector, in the social economy. But it is a critical mess because a lot of this is disconnected. What we need is to move from that critical mess to a critical mass. And that passes through connecting these different movements, the well-being economy, the democratic innovations movement, the universal basic income campaign. All these things need to be connected as part of a broader, coherent theory that says there are alternatives. Some of them, we see them on the ground at a certain scale. And what we need is that sort of expanding of the public imagination so that we believe we can get there, and then politicians need to follow. They're not going to lead on this. They're going to have to follow. So we need to push them so that they can follow.
Yeah, I think there's an important point just there around, I suppose, policy fragmentation. There's a lot of stuff happening, around universal basic income and minimum income guarantee, all those kind of things, and they're not joined up enough. But I think also that point around narrative and changing the story, I think is essential, absolutely essential to that. I'm just going to post a link in the chat actually, because there's an initiative called the Scottish Beacon, which some of you will have heard of, which is local newsletters from around Scotland who've collectively come together on a national scale to create the Scottish Beacon and tell those local stories. I think it's just a really good example of a good initiative. Any of our other speakers want to come back on any of those points at all? Craig?
Yeah, just very, very quickly for me is to offer a message of hope, really, because everything that Oliver just said there about the building that critical mass for campaigns. I mean, I've now been in the political sphere long enough that I've won campaigns, I've lost campaigns, but one of the big lessons I've learned from all of them is that everything in politics looks as if it's impossible right up until the moment it becomes inevitable. These tipping points happen, and they sometimes happen unexpectedly. A news story just breaks and goes viral, and suddenly everything happens around it. Sometimes it happens so gradually that you look back and you realize, that's when it became inevitable back then, when that minister said that word. But in all cases, you feel as if you're not making progress until suddenly you win. And I think local government's going to be one of those things, in much the same way that the debates around devolution in Scotland were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when we got the Scottish Parliament. There were a lot of very fraught and strong fights around that, and it looked as if it was going to be impossible until it happened.
Very good point. I like that hopeful point. It's all good. I don't know if Mia or Elizabeth, you would like to come in on any of those points at all? You
Yeah, I
don't
was
have
just
to,
going
but
back to some of the points that Oliver and yourself, Duncan. So, in terms of that popularising the ideas and the answers around citizens and communities, we're hopeful that the local democracy campaign starts to really get some of that traction. But the other piece of work that we are working on in terms of that storytelling is with the Scottish Beacon. So we're working with a few of our members who are going to be going out into their communities to build that storytelling around community wealth building. So it's that age old that we hear that community wealth building isn't new, it is happening, it has been happening, and how do we capture that? So we are supporting some members to be able to do that, and that will be coming out over the course of the next, before the end of this year as well, to help some of that stuff. So hopefully we can get some of those stories amplified where they need to be.
that sounds great, actually. Yeah, that sounds really, really good. Mia, do you want to comment at all?
I've just been listening. This is absolutely amazing stuff that I actually wasn't aware of. So no, I think that also the only thing I'll say about that is clearly there's just so much absolutely amazing work happening across all the sectors, and that's what you guys are doing with this webinar series, just connecting those dots. That's what we need to keep going as well, so that nobody, especially as we work in rural and island Scotland, like no one feels like they and their community is all alone trying to reinvent the wheel when there are all these absolutely amazing initiatives out there. So yeah,
Yeah, I completely agree with that. To be honest, I'm learning a lot myself already so far. Yeah. So the question in the chat just from Christine around lived experience, and I think this is something we put in the information around the webinar actually. So lived experience is talked about a lot in terms of consulting and listening to people with lived experience in our communities. But I suppose Christine's question is, right, how do we get beyond that so that lived experience is leading this agenda? Because it's often tokenistic, I think, when it comes to people with lived experience. So I don't know if any of our speakers have got a particular view on that lived experience point at all. So there is good work happening, which Christine has posted there. The With Is For Us initiative from Scottish Recovery Network, for example. So there is stuff happening, but it's kind of getting beyond that, getting beyond the rhetoric theme of the webinar to that kind of real, authentic lived experience. So none of our speakers have to answer, just to clarify, but if anyone would like to make any points around that. Craig, if you want to come in.
Yeah, just very quickly around. I mean, this is an important issue. You can't design a service unless you include the people who will be using it. But I have seen this idea of lived experience almost misused in certain areas as well, especially around the debates we had with the National Care Service, where this was almost used as an excuse to push some voices out, especially the voice of carers over those being cared for. This isn't to criticise the idea of using lived experience, but more just to caution against its misuse, because the people providing the service also have a lived experience of the service as well.
And I think it's the broader point around getting beyond consultation and listening, which we get a lot of. We're very aware of that. We get consulted on everything you can imagine, but it's like what action is being taken by policymakers around that listening exercise. I think that's certainly what we're talking about, is getting beyond that. So, Ewan Leach from Surf, would you like to come in with a question?
Yep, thanks very much, Duncan. Really interesting presentations. Thank you very much, everybody. It's picking up on something I suppose that Craig and Oliver said. So I'm all in favour of subsidiarity, and we are the least democratic nation in Europe. However, our European colleagues, while having greater subsidiarity of decision-making, also have inequality, xenophobia and racism. And I suppose, how do we manage, if we were to have greater subsidiarity, there may be greater representation of ideas that are currently not in our established political movements, although I agree that this year it's creeping in the next year's election, we're likely to see a party represented in Scotland that we haven't seen before. But with that greater sort of democratic participation, how prepared, because I think I somehow have a feeling that in this room we're all kind of wet liberals, and we're used to hanging around with that. But within the political environment, within the public environment, there are obviously views that I would find very oppositional and difficult possibly to work with. But in having greater representation, how prepared do you think we are to kind of deal with that as a nation?
That's a very big and important question. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So any of our speakers, or indeed any of our attendees, would like to talk about that particular point, feel free.
Yeah, okay. So, Ewan, I get that. But this is, in a way, your question has a lot to do as well with the existing spaces that we have for participation, for consultation. When you go, for example, to a climate assembly, I'm not thinking about the Scottish one. For example, the latest assembly I've been involved with was in Norway, where they have this mega multi-billion, hundreds of billions fund that comes from oil, which creates a lot of debate around the ethics of it and how it should be used and how it should be how it should evolve in light of the climate emergency. And the Norway Climate Assembly, the assembly they hosted and finished just a couple of months ago, had people from all ideological backgrounds and had people who found themselves in different parts of the ideological spectrum, etc. And they were able to reach common ground on a number of proposals that go far beyond what the existing political establishment wants to do. This is a characteristic of all climate assemblies across Europe. We have a book coming out where we explore some of this, where the proposals, the recommendations, the conclusions of some of these new civic institutions tend to take policy arenas far beyond the status quo where things are. And that is not with one section of the population, that is with a cross-section of the population being given a space that is outside the gladiatorial arenas of everyday party political life, and putting a space where they need to engage with ideas, values, consequences, the future, and not just the present, the common interests, and not just private interests. So once you create those kind of spaces, the equation changes. It's easier to listen to those who think different you when you know that you're going to be listened as well, and then you're going to be trying to find what kind of areas there are of common ground. And surprise, often there is far more than we think. We're often divided by the processes that are meant to bring us together. So this is not to say that consensus is easy or common ground is easy to find, but there's far more than what our current political institutions manage to reflect. So I'm hopeful because I've seen it in practice. I also see it in community anchor organizations where I see people from all kinds of backgrounds, or in development trusts, all kinds of backgrounds coming together and to make things happen, united by wanting to respond to existing need or existing ambition. So I think there's a more hopeful narrative of how we are as citizens when we're given the right spaces to come together and try to think constructively.
Any of our other speakers want to pick up on any of those points at all?
I've said it all for me.
That's all good. And there's a question in the chat as well around a point really being made around engaging voices from BAME backgrounds, migrant backgrounds, etc. And I think that was a point that came from our first webinar as well. Actually, I think it's a really important point. So, we're all excluded from policy processes, pretty much all the time for a lot of people. But particularly with excluded voices, that's more stark, I think, as well. So if anybody wants to make any points around that, around ethnic minority groups or other protected characteristics. Any of our speakers or attendees?
Yeah, I love that this was raised, and completely agree. I'm half Chinese, and often get told, "Oh, there are no minorities in Northern Ireland, Scotland." I'm like, well, are we sure? And how can we? Yeah, so 100%. I think a lot of people. What we found is, even within our membership, that it's, again, rural and Ireland, Scotland is very different in terms of they're being harder to find, and we're the collectives, the grassroots level grouping of them have not really made it through all of the levels to be able to be found and kind of picked up by the larger networks, by the regional networks, by the national networks. So we all have a role to play in really strengthening that grassroots level, strengthening that representation, them finding each other. And yeah, just being aware that they do exist. And if they are not in the room, then asking those questions on why were they not involved to date, and adopting participatory processes where the invitation does go out and does permeate through the grassroots, or at least the local, or at least the regional level, is a step in the right direction. I do agree it's not going quickly enough, though. And I do look at events taking place in more urban areas, more diverse areas, and say that definitely has to be improved. Running out of excuses there. But yeah, definitely we have to keep that in mind when we say it's diverse, when we say it's inclusive. It's not really until those people are actually in the room, in the event. And maybe that means making it more hybrid. Maybe that means being more flexible around hours. But yeah, we all have a role to play in finding those groups, finding those people, and making sure that they are part of everything that we're doing and creating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is very much about adapting and being flexible to what people need to engage as well, rather than saying, here's the process, here's the mechanism. It's like, well, what do people want to engage with? How do they want to engage? What time of day kind of thing? I think that's a really important point to make, actually.
Duncan, could I add something here quickly? Because 2 points. One is more practical and builds on Mia's point, and the other is a broader point. So the practical one is we understand very well the barriers to participation. We've done research on this endlessly, and we know that participatory processes, unless there are enough measures to reduce barriers to participation, will systematically exclude all kinds of people in the population, which is why we have ever-growing consultation and ever-growing inequalities, because consultations capture only certain sections of the population who have the time, resources, confidence, and so on to shape current policy agendas. So this is really important, and democratic innovations are working really hard to try to overcome that and be more inclusive. But then there's a bigger point. You cannot have a participatory democracy if you don't have a participatory society, and you cannot have a participatory society if you don't have a participatory economy. These things are linked. That's why universal basic income and other proposals in that direction that recognize that people are busy. How do you get people who are full-time carers or part-time carers, anyone who has any kind of responsibilities, anyone who belongs to a minority that faces structural, given the current way we organize work, and life, it's really, really hard to expect people to be able to participate in political life. To achieve that, we're going to have to reform at the same time the way we work, the way we live, the way we organize our society. So these things are connected, the everyday practices and the big questions.
Great. Just to let you know that Andy's just shared a poll about the webinar as well. So if that's just popped up on your screen, please do fill it in. It'll take you like 5 seconds or something just to say how you found the webinar today, so we can then report back to various people about the success or not of the webinar. So we've got a couple more minutes left, so we can take a couple more questions, final questions. I'm particularly keen to hear from people at a local level who have basically faced barriers to participation, maybe with the local authority or maybe with national government, and kind of what you think might need to change in that regard as well. So just some practical examples if there's enough people here to make that possible. So feel free just to put your hand up, or you can post in the chat as well.
I can give a practical barrier from my own point of view.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
To do with local government. I live in South Lanarkshire, but I live in a relatively rural part of it. If I wanted to go and visit my local council, South Lanarkshire Council, in person, and I was completely reliant on public transport to do it, it's actually easier for me to visit Glasgow City Council in person than to get to South Lanarkshire. It's faster and easier to get to Glasgow than the seat of my own local authority. The hall where if we had a community council, we would be using, it's just around the corner. It's within walking distance. That's the difference in accessibility when it comes to these things. Again, my German father-in-law, he actually lives in a fairly large municipal council as Germany goes. It's got a population of about 20,000. The average in Germany is about half that. But even then, his municipal council is about a 20-minute walk away, or a 5-minute drive, or a 5-minute bus ride. The bus stops at the end of his street. Is that kind of granularity of accessibility is what's needed to make that to break down that transport barrier. Never mind all the other barriers that get in the way of local government.
Hopefully if the Democracy Matters conversations go in the right direction, obviously the action is taken around community councils. I think there's a lot of potential there, actually. I think, to be honest, as long as they are reformed properly and funded, and that comes to a point in the chat as well around funding for this as well. I mean, democratic innovation and participation can't happen without funding, and that's funding for underrepresented groups as well as the funding for the bigger structures. Christine, Scottish Recovery Network, you've got your hand up if you want to come in.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, we're a mental health organisation, and something that we find a bit of a barrier is people's understanding of lived experience engagement. And it's been great over the past, 15, 10 years that people are using the term lived experience, they're recognising it, but actually quite a lot, particularly in the NHS, people see lived experience as bringing someone into a meeting to share their mental health story, and they're like, right, we've done lived experience, when actually lived experience is about people being involved in the planning, design, delivery of services, but also in how you're getting people with lived experience in to engage. So they should be leading the way and not just brought in at the stage, we need to talk to somebody with lived experience. But we're making strides, we're getting there. Lived experience is much more prominent in the mental health strategy and delivery plans. Well, delivery plan 1 that's out. It's quite common language now across the sector, but it's about taking it that step further and seeing people with lived experience as people with knowledge, skills, experiences that could be leaders in developing mental health services.
I think that's a very key point as well, to be honest. It's about wisdom. I would use the word wisdom. It's about knowledge, about what works, what doesn't work. In terms of public services reform, for example, it's like the people who use the public services, maybe ask them, they are the ones who use the services. They will know, this is the point. This is the core point you just made there, I think, around democracy and what democracy really means. So it's just after 1 o'clock now, so we do have to wind up just there. But thank you for all your questions. I think that's a really brilliant discussion, to be honest. And what we'll do is we'll send through a list of resources resources after as well, with some web links. So we're aware that there's a lot of information there to digest, a lot of quite complex information. So we'll send through some key web links to help you discover more around maybe what's happening in your local community, what's happening across Scotland, because there is a lot happening, I think. And I think just coming to that point about storytelling, I think that's what we need to do better, is storytelling, changing that narrative around democratic engagement and the role of social enterprise within that. And really the role of lived experiencing is really, really essential. So thank you everybody for coming along today. Thank you to our 4 speakers. I think you've been brilliant, really, really different perspectives, really, really interesting, and have a good day. Thanks.